Hi, Adam Cox here, and today I'm going to be talking about the techniques that I use to eliminate phobias very, very quickly. In the media, I'm known as the phobia guru, and if you put phobia expert in Google, I'm normally the first name that comes up. And that's because I've got a track record at removing and eliminating phobias in a single session. So the top question that people actually ask me when it comes to dealing with phobias is they say, Adam, what do you actually do? What techniques do you use? What approaches do you use to actually remove the phobias? So this video, I'm going to talk you through exactly what I do. And some of these techniques require me to work face-to-face with people or via Skype. So it has to be one-on-one so I can calibrate what they're thinking, what they're doing, and in what sequence they're doing it. But in many cases, I have audio downloads of clinical hypnotherapy protocol that enable people to experience the same process without having to work with me directly. So this video is simply what I do to help people remove and eliminate their phobias. So a bit about me. My brand is the Phobia Guru. People know me for being a phobia expert. I'm also a clinical hypnotherapist based in Harley Street, which is in central London. And I'm a radio presenter on Share Radio. So many people have heard my show, which is called Modern Mindset. Share Radio is a national radio station that talks about personal finance and business. So I do the psychology segment on that particular radio show, and I'm a public speaker. Regularly, people will see me talking to audiences, anything from 15 to 20 people to many hundreds, about why fear is important, but also how important it is to remove those fears that are no longer useful. Part of how I became so famous for being a phobia expert is because the media caught on to what I was doing in terms of removing phobias very, very quickly, and not just classic phobias like fear of dogs or fear of spiders, but even the more rare phobias, and of course got featured regularly on TV and radio and in the media, which is why I'm seen, as far as the UK media is concerned, as an authority, as a go-to person whenever they want an expert to talk about phobias and why we have them. So the first technique that I really use is very much about the way that I look at it, and hypnotherapists like myself love metaphors. And one of the metaphors that I really like is that neural pathways follow a particular chronological sequence. So you go through a process very, very quickly. And I want you to think about a skill that you can do very well. So that might be driving, for example, or it might be typing, or it might be doing something specific to you, such as a hobby. Now, the reality is, if you've got a certain level of competency with that skill, then it normally means that you're doing things on autopilot. So driving, for example, if you've been driving for many years, you probably have the experience of driving on autopilot without actually consciously thinking about what you're doing. Now, that's important, because if I were to ask you, if you're a driver, a recent time when you drove somewhere, and I said, right, talk me through the process, what did you do? Chances are you're going to miss out vital parts of that process. You'll probably have already chunked it down because it's an unconscious process. So for example, if I said, right, how did you get to that particular place? You might chunk it down so much that you simply say, I drove there. And this is what is happening consistently when people have phobias. They simply say things like, well, I saw the thing, or I had this presentation to do, and then suddenly I was anxious. And that's not strictly true, because if you were driving from your home to your workplace and you've done that journey several times, then you will find that all these little things that you do, actually, you don't remember. So, for example, you would need to find your keys. You would need to unlock the car. You would need to start the ignition of the car. You would need to move it into gear. You would need to take the handbrake off. You would need to drive, signal. All these tiny little things are crucial. Now, why this is important is because if certain parts of that automatic process weren't there, you would never get to your destination. Okay? If, for example, there were no batteries in the central locking for the keys, then the car wouldn't open and you couldn't start the car. Or if you'd lost your keys, you couldn't get into the car to begin with. Or if your battery was flat. So all these things would prevent you from actually getting to your destination. And your phobia is like that. It's a learned skill. It doesn't feel like a skill, but it is. You've learnt unconsciously to get from a situation of being with no fear or anxiety whatsoever to a heightened state of anxiety very, very quickly. And a useful metaphor is dominoes. Because if you look at the image in front of you, these dominoes, you know what would happen if you tipped over the first domino. You would know that the first domino would then tip over the second domino, then the third, until it went right through to the end and all dominoes have fallen down. This is what it's like with your phobia. Certain things have to happen in a certain order, and if they don't happen in that order, you will never reach the state of severe anxiety or panic. So this particular approach, what I call a pattern interrupt, can only work when I'm working one-on-one with clients. And the reason for that is because I need to work out what the individual dominoes are for that particular person. For example, for someone to be afraid of spiders, in many cases, they might have to either see or think of a spider. That might be domino number one. Domino number two might be to make that picture really big in their mind's eye. And domino number three might be an internal monologue or dialogue where they say things like, oh, it's getting towards me, or it's getting closer. So there's a certain sequence of dominoes that are required for that person to feel a particular state of anxiety. So when I'm working one-on-one with someone, what I do is I ask the question, what would I need to do to feel what you feel? And by asking certain questions, looking at their eye movements, their body language, even paying close attention to the words that they use, I'm able to pick up on the things that they've forgotten that they do because it's happening completely unconsciously. And what that does is it enables me to work out what the sequence are for that particular person in order to feel anxious. So the great thing there is that if, for example, if you look at this image of the dominoes, you started thinking, right, what would happen if two of those dominoes in the middle were simply missing? You would know that even if you flicked the first few dominoes over, they would topple, but they would never reach the second half of the dominoes, in which case it wouldn't get to its destination. And that's something that I do with clients. Essentially, I look at the sequence of events, the dominoes, and in what order, and then I work with them to change what the dominoes are and also the direction that they go, so that it's not possible for them to reach the destination of anxiety. At which point, you might be thinking, well, if they never reach to the stage of panic or anxiety, where do they end up? Well, one of the things that I try and do is elicit from them a time where they've been very resourceful in a time where perhaps other people have been panicky or anxious. And most people have this experience. They have had a time in their life that when everyone around them was losing their head, they were in a very resourceful state. So what I tend to do is the start of the sequence has to be the same. Because if the start of a sequence is being invited to speak at an event, for example, or booking flights to go on a particular holiday, the start of the sequence is important, is exactly the same as what you will experience in real life. But the important things are that we want to change are the evaluation or the internal imagery or the internal self-talk so that it never gets very far. And in fact, we can then reroute the dominoes, rewire the mental circuitry, those neural pathways. So although it starts off in the same sequence, it then goes to a state where the person is feeling more resourceful. And sometimes resourceful is just the absence of fear and anxiety. So for example, many of my clients are experiencing anxiety on a level of 8 or 9 or 10 out of 10 on a scale of 1 to 10, what we call the subjective unit of distress. If they can go through exactly the same initial event, so being in the environment that triggers their anxiety, and that anxiety only reaches a 3 or a 4 or a 5, the fact that it never reaches heightened states of anxiety means that that anxiety is manageable. So it doesn't have to be that someone who is afraid of dogs suddenly loves dogs. Simply being ambivalent, not caring if dogs are around, will feel like paradise to someone that has spent almost their entire life being completely terrified by dogs. So this approach is what I call the pattern interrupt, or the rewiring technique, and it's essentially where I model what the individual has to do to experience the anxiety and then mess up that pattern so it never works in the same way. And a useful analogy for this, for example, is if you remember old vinyl records, for example. Vinyl records follow certain grooves, they follow certain sequences, so the needle on the record goes around in a particular order. Now, if you completely scratch and mess up that pattern on the grooves, then even if you played the record that was the same record as before, because you've messed up the pattern, it doesn't play in the same way that it did. And that's essentially what I do for clients. And a useful example of how quickly a pattern can change is an example that I use for myself that doesn't involve a phobia, but does involve unconscious behavior. So in my teenage years, for example, I used to love eating apple turnovers. And there was one time when I was eating an apple turnover, completely on autopilot, as many people do with a packet of crisps or chocolate. But I was eating this apple turnover, and there was a crunch where there shouldn't have been a crunch. And as I look into the half-eaten apple turnover in my hands, I can see half a wasp that's wriggling around. And then I could feel something else moving in my mouth. And at that point, of course, I spat it out, saw that it was the remainder of the wasp. Luckily, the stinging part was in the apple turnover. But suddenly, by associating huge amounts of disgust, particularly unexpected disgust, to that particular situation, now meant that I had new associations linked. I'd messed up that automatic pattern. So it could never work in the same way as it was before. So whereas before I was eating lots of these apple turnovers, going onwards, I've probably eaten maybe 2 or 3 in my entire life since that point. So you can change a pattern very quickly, and it just doesn't work the same way as it did before. So that is pattern interrupt and what I call rewiring. And this rewiring is actually a good analogy because neural pathways are a bit like the internal circuitry of the brain. So that's the process of the pattern interrupt and rewiring. Anchoring courage and resourcefulness is an approach which uses an NLP technique. When I do workshops with people, quite often groups of 20 people, what I tend to do is right at the beginning of the day, I get them to access certain resourceful states. Now, these resourceful states could be resourceful states like courage, for example. Courage is a very, very useful state, mainly because courage is the ability to take action even in spite of anxiety. And why that's so important is that whenever you take action, it reduces anxiety because you then have evidence that you're not going to let the anxiety hold you back. How anchoring works, if you look at the image on the right-hand side of the screen here, there is a psychological principle called the law of dominant effect. And essentially what it means is that you can't have 2 conflicting emotions experienced at the same time. So you can't experience happiness and sadness at the same time. You can't experience fascination and disdain or boredom at the same time. It's just not possible. So how anchoring works is that whichever is the more intense emotion displaces the weaker emotion. And there was a very famous study, one of the most famous studies, in fact, in psychology, particularly behavioral psychology, with a scientist called Pavlov. And what Pavlov did is he noticed that when he studied dogs, particularly their eating habits, what he was able to do, and he did this study where he attached test tubes to the saliva glands of dogs. And then what he found is that if he gave the dogs their food, the actual providing of their food increased the amount of saliva. He then did something which is the basis of conditioning, which he found that if he rang a bell at the very same time as giving the dogs their food, what would happen is that they learned that the bell represents their food, to the extent that simply ringing the bell also caused the dogs to salivate more because they associated it. And if you have a pet dog, you've probably experienced something similar, where simply picking up a lead, even if you don't plan on taking your dog for a walk, still gets the dog excited because it associates the lead with going for a walk, something that's pleasurable. So we can take this principle, and it's just using NLP techniques is a more precise version of essentially this conditioning learned response process. So what we do is we get people to go back to a time where they felt very courageous or very fascinated or very resourceful, and then we anchor that. We get them re-experiencing in a particular way an intense emotion that is a useful, resourceful state. And then we get some kind of physical and auditory trigger to enable them to access that state when they want it. Now, to give you an idea, this exists in advertising all the time. Certain jingles for companies, for example, certain smells can be anchored. I'm sure you've had the experience of experiencing a particular smell, for example, or favorite song. Supermarkets will have the smell of freshly baked bread actually kind of pumped out to the front of the store so that you have that kind of reaction. Smells, for example, tend to be very powerful influencers on emotional states. So the key thing that the way that it works on the anchoring, and I do this face to face, but I also have an audio download of this process because the structure that it follows it makes it possible for someone to experience this without having to work with me one-on-one. Really is about going to that point where they had the very resources that are going to be necessary to start eroding the fear. And courage is probably one of the best ones, because it means that in that courageous state, they feel more able to do the very thing that is causing anxiety. And if we can get an intense enough form of courage, that then becomes the bridge so that they can then take the action to prove that the fear is nowhere near as bad as they think it is. And I mean, I do phobia workshops where arachnophobes, high-level arachnophobes, turn up. And at the end of that course, they will hold huge tarantulas. And the reason that they do that is to provide evidence that they are through their fear. But there is an interesting thing that I've observed, and that is that what's happening in their head is different from what's happening in reality. So they might have to take 5 or 10 minutes to work themselves up to that courageous state where they can actually have a tarantula walk across their hand. Here's the interesting thing. At the very point where the tarantula has walked across their hand, there's a feeling of, oh, was that it? The anticipation and the internal perception of the fear was completely separated from the reality of that experience. And that's why courage is so important, because getting yourself to a state where you can actually do the thing then means that you've got evidence that you don't have to experience distress when you're in that situation. So it can massively break the pattern for good. So as part of the 7-day phobia removal system, this is one of the audio downloads that you will experience. And you can use this again and again, and also not just for phobias, but simply accessing certain resourceful states. That could be confidence, for example. Maybe there's something that you want to do and you want a bit more confidence, or you want a bit more creativity. You can use this exact same process to experience resourceful emotional states that might be useful at some point in the future. So this is anchoring courage and resourcefulness. The staged dissociation protocol is a very specific process where we take people through a hypnotic process, so an induction, a deepener, and then they go to their own cinema. Okay, but it's an unusual cinema in the sense that it has 3 different screens. And what we do is in this process, we are highlighting to the unconscious mind that there was a time before this phobia existed. Knowing that you're only born with 2 fears, and both of those fears can be unlearned, so you don't have to have that fear your whole life. means that there was a period that existed in your life before this phobia was a problem. Okay, so the screen on the left represents the screen of your past. Okay, a time that you can recall where this phobia didn't exist. And then the screen on the right of this 3-screened private empty cinema where you're there as a guest is a screen that shows you in the future, perhaps a year from now, having been free of the fear for a long period of time. And you know that because on that screen you're doing something that you could only possibly do if your fear was gone. And then the screen in the middle is essentially something that we use to rewire the process. Now, it's not the same approach that I use with the pattern interrupt, but it uses principles of the pattern interrupt process. We get you thinking about a recent time when you've experienced your phobia in such a way that actually you feel that you can do things differently. So we change the perspective, we change things like the direction, we even change the time sequence to change that pattern to put you in a situation where you feel that actually you are free of your fear. Now, this is an audio download, but I can do this face-to-face and then tailor the content with the individuals. But this is essentially a process where we access resources from the past, we access the blueprint, because if you think about it, a lot of people make plans for the future. So therefore, they know what the future looks like, but because it hasn't happened yet, it can only exist in their mind. Now, if you have a belief system that you have a phobia and you believe that you will have that phobia your entire life, if you want to make plans for the future and those plans collide with what your phobia is, then you tend to not make those plans or you find a workaround around them. Once, however, you have processed that your future is different, then you are able to make different choices about what you do in the future because the perception is that the fear is gone, which then becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So this is a protocol that is a hypnosis protocol but uses principles of NLP, and you can listen to this on the audio download version as many times as you want, and also with all kinds of different fears and phobias. It also can work with certain habits and things like that, things that you're doing that you no longer want to do anymore. So this is one of the things that I use in workshops. I use it one-on-one with clients, but it's also available as an audio download. And essentially, it breaks the pattern, anchors the resources of the past, and then gives you a blueprint of what the future looks like. So the parts therapy protocol is based on the concept that there is a part that was created at the point where the phobia was integrated into your unconscious mind. And there are many theories that say that the reason why you get these high levels of anxiety is because that part is trying to protect you in some way. Now, parts therapy have many applications, but it's essentially solving the problem of inner conflict. So before I talk through why parts therapy works and how it works, what I want you to do is to think of a time where you feel that something that you want to do is a struggle. Okay, now that might be losing weight, that might be achieving a particular goal or project, but if it feels like a struggle, it's probably because you're moving in different directions. And many of people have had the experience of making a New Year's resolution and they're feeling very motivated, they're focused, they're committed, they definitely want to do this thing. But then within a few days, sometimes weeks or even months, they're then doing something which is absolutely opposite to the very thing that they want to do. Now, if a part of you is pulling in one direction and another part is pulling in the other direction, then you're kind of playing a game of tug of war with yourself. It becomes impossible for you to actually make any progress because you're moving in different directions. Now, having worked with so many phobics, the part responsible for anxiety is normally a protective part. It's trying to help you either prepare or cope with what's happened or could happen. And the key goal of the parts therapy is to communicate with that part elicit its positive intention, and then find a negotiated solution so they can still help, but in a way that doesn't create the kind of paralysis that comes in many cases from severe anxiety or phobias. So the metaphor that I'm going to use here for this is that this particular process, which I do face-to-face with clients, but is also available as a download, essentially turns a tug of war pulling in different directions to a three-legged race. And a three-legged race is a useful alternative to the tug of war, because if you've ever run a three-legged race, maybe as a child at school on sports day, you'll know that it's not easy and you don't get to run very fast. But at least these two parts that were pulling in different directions are now moving in the same direction. So don't expect it to be perfect, but do expect to be able to make progress after listening or experiencing this particular form of therapy. So regression to the point of creation, what I like to call the point of inception. There was a point where your phobia didn't exist, okay? And if you have a phobia now, that's because there was a point before the phobia and there was a point after that phobia, and therefore there must have been a point of inception. Now, the point of inception could be a particular sensitizing event. Recently, for example, I heard a story of someone that had a fear of stickers. So stickers, particularly the stickers on fruit. So stickers on apples or bananas and things like that. And that's because as a child, the client could recall a time where sitting in a pushchair, a stranger raising money for charity, I think her mum donated for the charity, and then this stranger simply put a sticker on the child. She experienced that, but because it was unexpected and it was a strange person doing it, she was distressed at the point where she received this sticker. And ever since that point, she had this kind of irrational fear, to use her words, of stickers, anything sticky. She just kind of associated in the same way that Pavlov and the dogs associated the ringing of a bell with food. She then associated these stickers with something unpleasant, unwarranted, and stressful or distressing. So going back to the point of inception, but with the benefit of experience, because when you're 3, 4, 5 years old, you don't have a lot of wisdom. You don't have a lot of experience to frame that. And her reaction at that point, being a vulnerable child, had an element of logic to it. You know, crying if a stranger invades your personal space is a useful thing to do because it could attract the attention of someone that could help you. Keeping that fear or that feeling of discomfort whenever you see a sticker is no longer useful. So in this particular process, we use regression. Now, many people have heard this phrase regression in the framework of past life regression. This is not past life regression. This is not based on a premise that you've had hundreds of lives previously and you're going to go back to a time when you were a warrior or a princess. This is simply going back to a time in your own life, and you're going to go back to the time seeing yourself as if you're someone else, but seeing the point at which the phobia was created, and also looking at what that purpose of the phobia was serving from that point onwards, and then actually breaking the very point of inception so that when that ripples through time, your own timeline, it then reaches a point where if it had never have happened, then you would never experience these things. And the great thing about hypnosis and using certain NLP techniques that deal with time is that we can actually tackle the problem before it became a big issue in your life. And then we need to integrate that change in your present, but also your future, and also the past as well, from the point of when you go back from your past to your present day. And a metaphor is used, and that metaphor is almost like throwing a stone into a pond, for example. You may throw the stone into the center of the pond, and that's the point of impact. But there will be ripples on the surface of that pond to every single part of that pond. Now, when we make this change, and it's using a clinical hypnotherapy basis, you've then got the ability to experience the ripples through your own timeline, your own experiences, because then you would see events that caused anxiety from a different perspective. You would see it from, oh, that was strange, but I understand why that happened now. And you would also experience the ripples of time through your future. So then you can imagine, well, actually, although that was the case then, it's no longer the case, and therefore my future is different. And it feels weird talking about time in this way, but it's genuinely how many people experience time, because they look backwards when they think about the past and they look toward the future. So it's almost like there is a direction, almost like a line that represents continuity from the past towards the future. And that's really, really useful, because for me, I had lots and lots of anxiety, severe phobias. And when I think about those times now, I know that they happened, and I know that I had those fears and phobias and anxieties, but I can see myself as someone that didn't have the same resources that I now have. So I'm able to look at the past with an element of perspective, but I'm also able to see the future. And in that future, those fears and anxieties don't exist. And interestingly, just as an anecdote, one of my fears was, and it was an interesting starting point, because I'm now heavily involved and regularly interviewed on the media. But I remember when I was about 12, 13 years old, and the radio station I was listening when I was doing a paper round early in the morning was asking people to phone in to win cinema tickets, a prize, for a question about Wimbledon, the tennis tournament. And I felt I could win this. So I called up, and then suddenly, at the point of calling up, I evaluated that potentially there could be lots of people listening and evaluating me. And that's the point of inception for my fear of public speaking. Wasn't speaking in front of an audience. It was speaking on a radio station. And now I've spoken to audiences of hundreds of people. And in fact, just this week, I was featured on national TV to audiences of approaching 1 million people. And there was no fear whatsoever. So just because something was the case doesn't mean it has to be in the future. And this particular process, which I can do face-to-face or as a download, enables people to go back to the very point where that phobia, that fear, that anxiety was created, but that we make changes at that very point so that the past is perceived in a different way from your present, and also how you think about the future is very different, so that you're able to make choices from a position of courage and confidence rather than fear, anxiety, and avoidance. The Swish pattern protocol is an NLP technique, and it's an NLP technique. So if you were to work with me one-on-one, for example, with the Swish pattern, then I'm going to be asking you to make certain pictures in your mind, and then I'm going to be doing certain things with those pictures or with those sounds to distort what they mean. So again, to go back to the domino analogy, there's a particular sequence and we mess up that sequence and it follows a different pattern. There's elements of that process in the Swish pattern protocol. It's also available as a download because the structure, although it can't be tailored to the individual, there are certain key components of the Swish pattern that mean that it is universally experienced in a particular way. And the reason why this works, by the way, is because in order to feel certain levels of anxiety, we normally, for many people, have to make certain pictures or sounds in our heads. This kind of image here of a thought bubble is quite useful because many people, in order to experience a certain level of anxiety, often put themselves back into a situation where the very threat that they don't like is happening to them as if they're looking at it through their own eyes. So the Swish pattern really enables us to change the perspective, but it also enables us to go from a state of high intensity emotions and then move it to a point where the same level of intensity simply isn't possible anymore. This is called the Swish pattern. And this download, if you experience this as a download, don't expect, calm, relaxing music and, lots of kind of passive experience. You're going to have to do lots on this particular one. So I'll be asking you to make a specific memory, recall that time, and then do certain things with that memory to mess up the pattern, and then also provide you with a sequence. So for example, many people know what the sequence is of lots of different things, like tying a shoelace, for example. If I ask you to imagine tying a shoelace, you would imagine doing that in a particular sequence. Okay? If, however, the initial thought of that suddenly led to somewhere else, then that would then become part of the sequence. So we can divert those dominoes to a different destination. It's different from just the classic pattern interrupt, which requires high levels of emotional intensity. This does it based on the actual submodalities of how we think. So for many people, particularly for those that have animal phobias, for example, the proximity to them and the animal, whether in real life or in their imagination, has a link to how much anxiety they fear. Also, whether or not they can move away, and if it's moving or getting closer to them, are certain ingredients that can increase intensity. Now, knowing that, we can actually change what you experience when you think about something that's happened, is happening, or could happen in the future, to put you in a more resourceful state. When you're in that resourceful state, then you can anchor that feeling of courage to then do the thing to beat the belief systems and associations by creating brand new associations. So one of the examples, and I did this with a client that had a fear of dogs, for example. So even just the thought of dogs freaked him out. By going through this Swish pattern, and I went through it several times in lots of different situations, past, present, and future. And then I basically knew that in order for him to experience a phobia of dogs, he had to think about dogs in a particular way. So we changed how he thought about them. But I also know that he was categorizing them as all dogs, so a huge generalization, are bad, unpleasant, whatever it might be. For him, it was an element of unpredictable. It was the unpredictability of the dogs that was more of a concern for him than the actual fear itself. So I needed to create a new association. So here in London, there is a big charity that homes dogs that have been abandoned or their owners can't look after them anymore. So I set this guy the challenge, homework, if you will, after our first session of going to Battersea Dogs Home. And obviously he was in a more resourceful state at that point. We'd already done a lot of the techniques to erode the very foundation of the fear. But his homework was to actually spend a lot of time around dogs. So a whole afternoon. And what I asked him to do, the specific homework, having gone to Battersea Dogs Home, I know that they have stories about the background of the individual dog. Now, if you are an arachnophobe, you don't, a cynophobe, so fear of dogs, you don't like thinking or spending time around dogs. Suddenly he was spending a whole afternoon around dogs. And one of the things that he was tasked to do was to read the stories and look at the names of every single dog. Now that was useful because then it gave him an association as to why some dogs are more aggressive. In many cases, it's because they've had irresponsible owners and, have been poorly treated in some way. So in the same way that having an anxiety response in a human can be a result of an earlier experience, the same can be true of dogs. Once he had spent an afternoon around, 50 or more dogs, hearing their stories, seeing them, he was able to start forming connections and seeing them as unique animals rather than an entire species. And it was the Swish pattern that made that breakthrough possible, because every time he thought about a dog, he then started off the same way, but then it took him to a different place. So when he was thinking about it, he was then more able to cope with the idea of being around dogs. And when we and having that feeling of resourcefulness at the idea is an important stepping stone to being able to do it in real life. And when you've done it in real life, well, then suddenly you've got evidence that you can do it whenever you want. So a very powerful technique, and it can work face-to-face because I can calibrate to the individual there, but it can also work as the download as part of the 7-day phobia removal system. So it's really important for me whenever I work with a client that they don't look at the therapy that I do with them as kind of almost like as a one-off. You know, it's really important that to get the best out of any kind of phobia removal system, it's really useful to look at the phobia as just evidence that when you remove it, if you can get rid of that fear, then all fears are temporary. So what's really, really important is what I call the convincer strategy. So even when I do therapy with people, I tend to set my clients homework. You know, I want them to do the very thing that would represent a terrifying level of fear, because there is a law of cognitive dissonance where people at some level evaluate how they should be feeling based on the situation and the actions that they take. So this element can be applied against us, and it can also work for us. So if, for example, you say to yourself, well, I must have a phobia because I felt like that around this, you know, small pigeon, for example, if it's a fear of birds, then that would then make you think, well, if it's around a lot of birds, then the fear would be even more intense. So that is a flawed belief system, but we can make that same element of the belief system work for you rather than against you. So, for example, there is a video on my website in the testimonials where I worked with an actress who had a fear of birds, and using different techniques, completely got rid of the phobia in less than 60 minutes. But then I had to set her a challenge. Now, luckily, working in Harley Street, it's next door to a square, one of the many squares in London called Cavendish Square, and I knew that square had pigeons in. So I then took her to this square and asked her to get closer to different pigeons. Now, because things had changed in her mind, whereas before she would have had this kind of freaking out response, a kind of raised heart rate, you know, kind of her body shakes, you know, crying and all that kind of stuff. Because she was able to be around birds and not have that reaction, then it meant that she had evidence that she was over her fear. Okay, and that's an important bit. So for me, I want people to do something to prove to themselves that the fear is gone and that they are a different person. And ideally, that will be something that you do publicly. Okay, there was a client of mine, for example, that had a fear of being on public transport. He had a couple of panic attacks on public transport, and was avoiding going on the London Underground. Now, by setting him, by doing the kind of techniques that I've already talked about, we massively reduced the level of anxiety. So he could think about being on the London Underground. He could think about times that he was on the London Underground in a different way to make him feel more resourceful. But I set him a challenge, or actually we worked together to come up with the kind of challenge that would enable him to break through his fear for good. So this is basically strategic goal setting, but it is also something called pseudo-orientation in time. So it's the opposite of regression. It is thinking about the future in a specific way where you're able to do the very thing that before would have created an anxiety response. You're then doing it first in your mind, but then in reality. So with this guy that had a fear of public transport and being in enclosed spaces, we found out that there was a charity that was particularly important to him. And knowing what I know about the biology, the actual kind of what happens in the brain when someone experiences anxiety or panic, I knew that adrenaline pretty much runs out after about 20 minutes, 25 minutes. So we decided that he would do a charity event, created a donation page where he would spend 12 hours on the London Underground raising money for a particular charity. And basically I said to him, I said, you know, what's going to be really weird for you is there will reach a point which will be success, which is where you've been on the London Underground for a few hours and you will be bored out of your mind. And that boredom that you experience at being on the London Underground will feel like a huge victory. Because if someone that has had panic attacks on the London Underground can get to such a stage where they feel bored and they're counting down the time and they're thinking, what, I've got 7 or 8 hours left of this, they truly have beaten their fear for good. So similar to that particular individual, this is about you thinking about the future, not just in a way that you will actually do something that defeats the fear for good, but also, absolutely crucially, you will think about what that future means, because by breaking through this fear, this phobia, you will then have evidence that you can break through any fear and any other form of anxiety that you have. And, certainly I can, from my own experience, categorically state that when fears are optional rather than perceived to be immovable, the world becomes a very exciting, opportunistic place. Suddenly, you're able to manage fears and reduce the fears that you don't want. You can still keep the fears that you do, but it becomes optional rather than obligatory. And the future becomes a very, very exciting place at the point where you have undeniable evidence that if you've beaten so many fears, then all fears are optional, and then you can essentially pursue whichever goal, whichever dream, whichever outcome that inspires you most. So the panic attack management system is a bonus. It's a short audio file that I've created, and I created it for a specific client that occasionally would have panic attacks. Now, the problem with a panic attack, just as a phrase, is it already implies that you're the victim and you're being attacked by an external thing called panic. It's happening to you rather than with you. Now, I have my own definition of panic, which is that it is a severe form of anxiety. So my own frame of reference is that if on a scale of 1 to 10, anxiety is under 6, then I kind of call it apprehension. It's quite a useful phrase for that level of anxiety, because it is anxiety, but it's manageable anxiety. If it's a 7 or 8, borderline 9, you can call it anxiety. Okay? And it's subjective, of course. This is a subjective unit of distress. So one person's 9 might be another person's 7. But in broad terms, I categorize it in this way. Panic is a level 9 or level 10 reaction of anxiety. So if it's that level, it tends to be panic. And at that point, you tend to have more input from the sympathetic nervous system, this communication between the hippocampus and the thalamus, which then pumps lots of neurotransmitters in the hope that it will be useful in some way. And the problem with that is that it tends to have an impact on what's actually happening in the body. You tend to breathe faster, very rapidly, and from the chest. Your heart rate tends to increase. And what can happen in certain individuals is because they're so focused on breathing, so they breathe very rapidly like this, then they forget to breathe out. And then there's a belief system, an internal monologue that I can't breathe. And it's true in the moment, because just try for a couple of minutes to breathe very shallowly and only breathe in. Suddenly your lungs are full, but that oxygen is depleted, and then you're running out of oxygen, and the key there is to breathe out. Also, if your heart's beating faster, then what can happen in a panic attack is that the person perceives it that I'm having a heart attack, or, and then they perceive it as something very, very distressing. Now, the panic attack management system is really something to use, and I recommend that people keep it as an MP3 stored on their mobile device or something easily accessible. Very useful for people that have a fear of flying, for example, because they can then have this particular audio file. So if they are experiencing symptoms of anxiety, then rather than them perceiving that they're about to have a panic attack and that these are the early warning signs, which is not particularly useful because it can create a self-fulfilling prophecy, instead I use the metaphor of a wave. And if you look at this image here where you've got a school of dolphins, kind of riding this wave, a wave is a useful way of thinking about anxiety, because nobody ever will or could have a permanent panic attack. It just doesn't happen. The body doesn't have the biological resources to do that. So a better way of thinking of anxiety, or in fact panic, is that it is a short-term wave. And I want you to think now of a time that perhaps that you were at the coast, the seaside, maybe as a child. Now, if you just kind of went in and there's quite big waves in the ocean, and a wave comes and you simply stay still, it's possible that the wave can knock you down. Even if you potentially run away from the wave, if it's a big enough wave and you're close enough to it, again, it's gonna be working against you. What you learn as a child is that actually, if you're going out into the sea and there are waves, one of the best things that you can do is to swim into the wave. And by swimming into the wave, suddenly it rises up with you, and then you kind of dip down. And that enables you to ride the wave of anxiety. And by riding the wave of anxiety, one, it has less impact. Secondly, as all waves are temporary. And what you tend to find is that the more you're able to actually work with the anxiety rather than have it work against you in conflict, then actually the smaller those waves and less frequent those waves come. So this is operating at the metaphorical level, but also there are specific suggestions and phrases, ways of thinking, because typically what happens when someone has a panic attack is that they're doing something with their breathing unconsciously, so taking conscious control of the breathing, but also there's a lot happening very, very rapidly. When you experience panic, all that adrenaline means that you think incredibly quickly and you have all this internal self-talk. Now, this particular system enables you to control those thoughts, slow down the pace, reduce the volume, and actually make it much more manageable. And then you find that actually, not only you're riding this wave, but actually the wave is temporary. It's not going to last much longer. And if you've got even 3 or 4 cases, actual evidence that you can ride the wave of anxiety or panic, and it doesn't kill you, and it's not as traumatic as it would be, as if it's suddenly an unexpected kind of reaction, you can almost positively anticipate certain waves. Because for many people, there is very little difference between the symptoms of panic and those people that experience severe forms of excitement. What's happening at the neurological level and the biological level are very similar. What's different is how that's perceived. So one person's nightmare is another person's dream. One person's panic is another person's fun. So the key thing is by being able to ride the waves of anxiety and even panic, suddenly it means that they are more manageable, you're in more control, and the more you do it, the less frequent and the less intense those waves become. Breaking Bad Habits is the second bonus download available, and this is a protocol that I created for all different clients, and it doesn't have to relate to your phobia. It's a bonus. It's just something as an added extra. So quite often, being a hypnotherapist, particularly a high-profile hypnotherapist, people come to me and they say, right, I want to give up smoking. I want to give up eating so much snacks or sugar or whatever it might be. One of my brands, for example, is Addiction Experts. And within Addiction Experts, of course, I break high-level addictions. Now, I would categorize a habit as a lower form of an addiction. So if you have a severe addiction, this won't be sufficient to break that. But if you just have a recurring habit that you don't want anymore, then this protocol is very useful to break that pattern. And it's really a short, about half an hour or so, system where you get to see the consequences. Because the thing with habits is that in the short term, they don't really have any impact. You know, if you're a chocoholic, for example, and you have too much chocolate on one day, it makes no difference to your health. It makes no difference to your waistline. One day of eating too much chocolate does absolutely no harm whatsoever. Okay, but that's the problem, because that form of rationalization means that the person that likes chocolate will emotionally associate into the pleasure of eating that chocolate. And chocolate is one of those things that also fires off neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine. So it feels good to kind of have that. It's anchored in the same way that many other things are. The taste, the smell, the packet will be associated with these feel-good things. So an individual with a habit like that will associate into the good things and disassociate into the things that can only happen over a long period of time. So eating chocolate too much on one day does nothing, really. Eating it every single day in medium quantities or even large quantities can have a very detrimental impact on health, well-being. It can lead to obesity. It can lead to potential type 2 diabetes. So the consequences over a long term are severe. Same thing with smoking. You know, if someone was to smoke once on one particular day, nothing happens. But a lifetime of smoking could mean that they are at risk of lots of different diseases and could die, you know, anything between 5 to 20 years earlier than someone that doesn't smoke. So this protocol is essentially about distorting time so the individual feels the long-term consequences. They associate into the long-term consequences and disassociate into the short-term pleasure. Because what I label short-term pleasure is the phrase gratification. Now, gratification, it's fleeting. You experience it and it's gone. But that can be part of the problem with habits and addictions, because then people have to revisit that thing to get that same kind of experience or pleasure. But then we need to replace it with something else. So what many people try and do with a bad habit or a habit they don't want anymore is go cold turkey. They simply stop that thing. What they don't realize, though, is that whatever that habit is meeting a particular need that they have. And simply stopping just means that your unconscious mind will find a different way to meet that need. So that's why many people, if they give up smoking, they end up eating more. So what you don't want to do is to leave it to chance that if you simply stop a particular habit, that nothing will fill that void. That's unlikely. So rather, it's not just breaking the bad habit, but replacing it with something more desirable that meets the very need that you had from the original thing, but just can deliver it in a different way. So for example, let's say if someone's habit is that they spend 2-3 hours a day on social media, the need that is being met there is potential connection with other humans. Okay, so that's a need that they might have, and it might be this kind of need to share or observe what's happening in other people's lives that they like or admire. Okay, that might be the need. But there are lots of other ways that you can meet that need without spending so much time on social media. So if we can meet that need in a different way, then that's what means that the change can last. If that person just simply stops going on social media, then they're relying on luck or chance that they will replace it with maybe conversations with real people. And that's not necessarily the case. They might just become addicted to reality TV or soap operas, for example, that might meet a similar need. So simply going cold turkey doesn't really work with these kind of things. What's way more effective is to deliberately replace it with something that meets the need, and your unconscious mind will know what that thing is. So this is an audio download as part of the bonus. Normally, when I go through this protocol face to face with people, one session with me is about £200. So you're getting that level of value in an audio download as a bonus for this system. And the final bonus is hypnotic wealth. So as a public speaker, Quite often I will do normally about 2 or 3 events a year where people that are interested in using hypnosis to increase their financial wealth will come and spend a day with me. And I have a short talk that I do which combines a hypnosis session, normally to a group of people, where they get to experience the key things that are getting in the way of them becoming wealthier. One of the key belief systems that people have about wealth is that somehow to be wealthy, they have to jeopardize or sacrifice their values, or that they're going to be less honest or less genuine as a person, that somehow being wealthy will make them, let's say, undesirable in some way. They have negative associations with that. So this download is all about giving you a blueprint of what different futures look like and the kind of insights that will enable you to reset your GPS. So in many cases, I know other people that are in the similar kind of industry to me, they will use a thermostat metaphor for wealth, that we are set to have a certain level of income or a level of wealth. I don't buy into that metaphor at all. I don't think that it's useful to just imagine that if we turn up the thermostat, that suddenly we're going to be wealthier. What's more likely and more effective, I found, is that having a metaphor that we are all on a journey, okay? And if you imagine a pilot, the vast majority of a pilot's journey is on autopilot. Literally, they will flick the switch and they are no longer in manual control of that plane. It will get there on autopilot, and they essentially are there to take off and land and manage particular issues with, let's say, high winds or storms and things like that. But the majority is done on autopilot. We all have an autopilot going on within us, and a combination of your values, your beliefs, and the total combined knowledge and strategies that you execute will determine your financial and wealth destination, almost like in a GPS, for example, and we can get to see where that is currently programmed to take you. So using the time distortion element of hypnosis, we can take you back to a time where you can almost communicate with your earlier self as to what insights, what strategies you would use to increase wealth. But also you get to go into the future and experience different futures. Now, one of those futures is a future of poverty, because sometimes it's useful to know a future that you don't want. You can also see the future that you're currently in line to experience, and then you can also experience a more desirable future. And the purpose of that is that this then can update your GPS setting as to what your financial future is going to be. And if you were traveling, let's say, to a destination and you took a wrong turn, then your GPS your sat nav would update and say, right, turn around, turn left, turn right to get you back on track. Autopilot would do the same thing. If you're flying a plane and you go off course, the autopilot will then reroute your course to make sure you still get to your destination. So this is a useful metaphor. Again, it's free as a bonus. Typically when I work with people for my hypnotic wealth talks, they pay hundreds of pounds to learn about the key belief systems that they can change and this kind of stuff. This audio download is not the full hypnotic wealth workshop and course, but it gives you a really good insight in terms of where your financial future is taking you on autopilot to at the moment, and you get to update this within this audio session. So this is the Hypnotic Wealth kind of audio download. Again, it's a bonus. You get it included as part of the 7-day phobia removal system. And I hope this has been useful, and look forward to working with you in one way, shape or form.